Hello, hello. I'm Leslie Hooper. Welcome back to my channel.
And I'm Steph Miramontes.
Today, we're going to be reacting to a video, a recent interview of Dr. Layne Norton, who was on the Diary of a CEO podcast hosted by Stephen Bartlett. So, Steph, buckle up because we're going to be talking about whether sugar is addictive or not. A little bit of a controversial topic depending on who you talk to.
Is sugar addictive?
This one's going to get me in trouble too. Um, Sugar by itself does not appear to be addictive. There are certain foods that appear to create what's called a food dependence. There's subtle differences between that and addiction. But I mean, kind of the anecdote is nobody's like just grabbing the bag of sucrose and just, eating that. And if you think about the foods that really are like very hard to stop eating, they're usually not just high in sugar. It's a combination of sugar, fat, salt, and texture. Okay, texture matters as well, and mouthfeel. People will say, "Well, sugar's addictive. Look at cakes, cookies, ice cream. There's more calories from fat in those than there are sugar in a lot of cases. So couldn't you, by that logic, just argue that fat is also addictive?" So sugar, straight sugar, doesn't appear to be addictive per se. Now, it's not very satiating, right? And it's utterly devoid of any other kind of nutrient. So I'm not saying it's a good idea to eat a lot of sugar, but it doesn't appear to have addictive qualities in isolation. But there are certain foods, cakes, cookies, these sorts of foods, hyper palatable, very great mouthfeel, potato chips, French fries. These sorts of foods may have like semi-addictive type properties,
Okay.
but just sugar itself doesn't appear to. And there's a study that kind of backs that up. Basically, I think the title was like no evidence for sugar addiction in humans.
So people will say, well, when I eat that piece of chocolate or that, sugary thing, I end up just eating more and more and more and more and more and more. And then the next day I feel like I need sugar more. And I've got my own sort of anecdotal experience of, I almost call it like a sugar cycle where there might be a week, once every 4 months or 6 months where I have some sugar and then the next day I want more sugar and then the next day I want more sugar and then the next day. And then when I break that sugar cycle, and if I don't eat sugar for like 5 days, it feels like the craving's gone away.
Mm-hmm.
You must hear that from people.
Yeah, I mean,
Like right now, I have no urge to have sugar for some reason.
yeah, it's so hard to disentangle that from just psychology in general,
Yeah.
right? And just like that could be a self-fulfilling thing where it's like, people have been told sugar is addictive or they've heard sugar is addictive. And so they
Could be
eat some and
mood
they
as
feel
well,
that mood.
I guess.
But
Yeah.
also, like, again, the chocolate usually also high in fat, right? Like the mouth feels really good. So I'm not saying like that stuff is easy to overeat on and people can have a hard time stopping, but it doesn't appear that sugar like independently is addictive, but it can be part of foods that may have addictive like properties.
Okay, thoughts on Dr. Layne Norton and Stephen?
I generally agree that sugar in and of itself is not addictive. I actually don't think that there are addictive foods, but I understand what people mean when they say addictive like qualities, when somebody feels like they're addicted to food. But as I've mentioned prior, you've got folks out here being like, I hate cake. I actually don't like cake. So cake is not inherently addictive. Anybody that feels they're addicted to cake, I love what Lane said about the psychology piece, about how you can't really disentangle all of this from the psychology of food as well, because self-fulfilling prophecy, when you feel like something is addictive, you're probably going to have more food thoughts surrounding it. And then we also have seen so many times in our programs how people will have this all or nothing thinking when they come in. And so they assign good food, bad food labeling to these things. They think these foods are inherently problematic. They're fattening the devil that lives in their home. And so as soon as they have it, they've paid the price of guilt and broken rules and things like that. And so now that they paid the price, they're going to keep eating and eating and eating more until they get the willpower to do what, what'd you say, Stephen was able to do. And that's like go a week without it. And now all of a sudden the cravings are down, partly because you're just not thinking about it because you think you're being good. You don't think these foods are a problem and you're not eating them. So you're being good. So you don't want them. You're on a roll. Momentum is on your side. But there are plenty of people that can have a bite of a cake or a couple bites of cookie or share one and not rob the store in the middle of the night, busting windows in bakeries, getting their addiction fix for a muffin. It just doesn't, that's not a thing.
Well, and we also like to pigeonhole it and say that it's exclusively sugar. So I appreciate that Layne brought to the table that it's usually a combination of fat, sugar, salt, and the texture. Look, we know the food industry definitely has a motive to make these foods as hyperpalatable, tasty as possible. But I do think that there's an element here of belief. I'm addicted to sugar is going to probably fuel an identity where we lose control with sugar. And now we start looking for evidence and collecting more data. And it just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we see this with our clients all the time. And I used to be someone who also felt out of control around sugar and started to believe that I was addicted to sugar. However, in my story, I remember there being a time where I could just stop at one cookie and it was not a battle whatsoever. And it wasn't until I started dieting and avoiding the cookies that I started to feel out of control around them to where I couldn't just stop at one. And when I tell myself I couldn't or I can't, then I don't. And so that is the psychological piece right there that we really do help our clients with in the program Unstuffed, because if you believe it, chances are you're going to act on it. And so it all starts and ends with the mind, essentially.
It's such a disservice to call something an addiction when the reality is it's way more nuanced than that. I like that he described this as some foods are just easier to overeat. They're not as satiating.
Sure.
100%. If you sit down to a meal of, I don't know, gummy worms, chances are pretty high it's not going to be very satiating. So when you think about calorie for calorie, you're going to get hungry sooner. You might get a little crashy. And you know what happens when you get a little crashy and tired and you get the drops? Your brain's like, I need some really fast energy. So then people think they're craving sugar. They think, hey, you know what's fast energy? More sugar and caffeine, but nobody's judging caffeine here. So caffeine is not on trial today. Sugar is on trial today. So I just think that also creates the self-fulfilling prophecy. I eat sugar. I'm not satisfied. It makes me hungrier. And then I think about more sugar and then I eat more sugar. And it's just this addiction that continues when in reality, if you have a meal and a cookie and you have them at the same-ish time, you're not going to experience that same drop, that same need for a quick energy because you've actually met your physical needs for energy and nutrients and not just pleasure. But pleasure is a big part of eating. It's an important part of eating. And it's really not helpful to say, cut all of the things that provide you pleasure out of your life because they have sugar and fat. Like nobody's sprinkling sugar on their avocado and calling that addictive, which is where the temperature and texture and pleasure of eating comes in as well. We're supposed to enjoy our food.
Yeah, well, I also just think what you resist persists. So if we are trying to avoid, then it becomes the forbidden fruit. It's more desirable. It's no longer something that we're treating as neutral in our lives. We have this strong emotional relationship with this food. So there's a lot of dramatic language. Oh, I'm being bad. I'm being naughty. I shouldn't do this. And there's an emotional component here when we have that kind of dialogue around certain foods, as opposed to if you eat it consistently, it doesn't have that kind of power or control over you. So it is easier to just stop at a couple of chocolates instead of the entire bag of chocolates. I always say where the mind goes, the body will follow. So we have to look at the thoughts, the ideas, the beliefs, the habits first and foremost. And I don't think anybody is truly addicted in the same way that we see addiction play out in people's lives. But I can certainly appreciate how it feels that way. And food is very powerful. If you have a very powerful story around it or a strong emotional need for it. So there's certainly a conversation to be had about how the two look very similar in our lives. But I just don't love people thinking that they are addicted, because then it disempowers you to make a change and you're not stuck. You're not going to have to avoid sugar for the rest of your life. You're not going to have to lock your pantry or never bring it into your house. I would rather teach you how to become someone who can eat it in a way that feels good, loving, kind, and, as I always say, hit that peak pleasure point and push it away, feeling like it was a win. Anything else you want to add, Steph?
Just similar to something that we've talked about in the past, it also brings that moral stigma. Well, I'm addicted. I have this addiction. And so then we have shame. And when we have shame, we want to do things in secret. And when we want to do things in secret, now we're eating sugar in secret, which makes us feel like we have a shameful addiction that we have to hide from people. And that is also the cycle that we've got to break.
Yeah, great point. All right. Well, that is it for us today. But if you found this helpful and are interested in hearing more, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn the notifications bell on so you don't miss a future video. We'll catch y'all on the next one.